Now, Led Zeppelin presents their 7th studio album, and this marks a new era for the band completely. Sort of after the Physical Graffiti tours, up until the band would separate at the end of 1980. And this era of the band is extremely bleak and extremely tragic. Number one reason for that, the music. Not very good at all. But even more than that is the history. With Plant and all the history with him and Page and the drugs and the Bonham and the alcohol. It's just really bleak, and it's kind of tragic to talk about because this is one of my favorite bands of all time. And so, just kind of looking back in retrospect, the band's just slowly dying, sort of after the Physical Graffiti tour. But anyway, more specifically about this album. Now, Robert Plant, after the Physical Graffiti tours, went to Morocco with his wife, and they got into a really, really bad car accident. This was very serious, but for some reason they just decided, after cancelling the tours, that they would do something. So they decided to record a new studio album. And they actually had to record it while Plant was still in a wheelchair, which you can definitely hear. Robert Plant's vocals aren't particularly enthusiastic at all, but I'll get more into that later. This was an extremely rushed album. I'm not sure whether it was, it wouldn't be pressure from the recording company, because Swan Song is created by Led Zeppelin, so it can't be that. But for some reason, this album was recorded and mixed in 18 days. Jimmy Page would often not sleep for 2 days. He'd often work about 18-20 hours, and I have no clue why they did that particularly. But they did, and it shows. This album is confused and not very well produced at all, but I'll get more into the specifics about that later. So, stylistically, what is this album? Bland. That's what it is. This is just the first Led Zeppelin album that's just a mediocre kind of rock album. It's nothing that special. We have funk elements in there and blues elements in there, but they aren't worked in well at all. This is just feels uninspired and doesn't feel like Led Zeppelin. Mediocrity is not something that I come to expect from Led Zeppelin, especially at this point in their career, after coming off of Physical Graffiti. So this is just boring at times, and this album is pretty short too, but at times it can just be completely unengaging and tonally and stylistically confused. But it's because it's just a kind of bland, boring rock album with nothing that special about it, so that's kind of how I feel about the album. Perfect way to sum it up. Go to the Wikipedia page of Physical Graffiti, go down to personnel, look how long John Paul Jones' line of instruments there are. There are about 17 different types of synthesizers, just all this stuff. Here, 4 and 8 string bass, that's all he does. No experimentation, there's no time for Led Zeppelin to experiment and stuff and play with stuff and really make stuff feel really intelligent and clever. This is just cut and paste riffs and melodies that are just feel stock and just record them. That's how I feel about this album. Now, having said that, there are some redeeming qualities. The writing is not that bad. At points, there are some really, really good pieces of instrumentation. Led Zeppelin are still absolutely amazing musicians. At times there's some really, really good solos, some really, really good bass playing by John Paul Jones, and some good drumming too. But overall, it doesn't really help the fact of the whole feel of this album is just confused and a mess. Now going into more specifically about the individual performances, Robert Plant, not good at all. One good vocal performance, and that's on the last track, T for One. Up to there, it's pretty bland, pretty boring, and very shallow and empty, his vocal performance. no depth at all, like there was on Led Zeppelin 1, where there was so much power, and he could hold back and then go back into power, and there's so much emotion there. None of that here. Lyrically, nothing that special about this album. Again, T for One is a couple pretty emotional lyrics in there, but other than that, it's nothing special at all. Page, great guitar playing. This is the last time Jimmy Page would be a really good guitar player for Led Zeppelin. Obviously, we'll talk more about that on Into the Outdoor. But yeah, it's just a really, really good guitar playing, really tight. But that doesn't really help the fact of the the overall feel that I've talked about enough. John Paul Jones does an alright job, nothing that special. And same with Bottom. There are some good examples of good rhythm sections. Oftentimes people will call this like a Page album. Like, this is just a guitar album. And yes, this is Led Zeppelin going for more just straight up guitar based jams, which is more, as I was talking about, just normal kind of rock music. But there's still good instrumentation from the rhythm section, so definitely not something to overlook. Album artwork, terrible. One of the worst pieces of artwork I've ever seen. I have no idea what it is. No creativity, no originality. The artwork sucks. Forget about it. Stupid artwork. Don't get it at all. Really, really terrible. Production. Recorded and mixed in 18 days, so what are you going to expect for the production? Obviously, on a technical level, it's good, because it's Led Zeppelin, with all the money that they could ever want at this point. So the production's good. The production's absolutely fine. But because of the whole 18 days thing, at times it feels unbalanced. Sometimes the bass is too high. A lot of the times the vocals are too low. It can sometimes come off as a bit unbalanced, the production. But on a technical level, there's nothing wrong with it. The writing. The writing, for me, is the biggest redeeming quality about this album. As I've said, there are good examples of good solos and good riffs and that kind of stuff, and some original moments and some occasions of dynamic playing from the band, but a lot of the times it can feel stale, and a lot of the times it just feels confused and uninspired. So let's go into deeper the track list. So this album begins with the first track, Achilles' Last Stand. Now this is probably the most famous song from this album. This, or maybe Nobody's Fault But Mine. But yeah, this is actually a really good song. Very different for Led Zeppelin to open with such a long song. This song's 10 minutes long, because usually they'd open with just a really fast, riffy song, but this is not like that at all. This shows off a lot of good guitar work, but there's no atmosphere. That's the thing about almost this whole album. It doesn't feel like it progresses, if you know what I mean. It's just good guitar playing and some more good guitar playing, but that's not enough for me to say it's a good album. Riffs, amazing guitar lines, some really excellent sections with some really fast drum beats, and with the guitar going along with that. That sounds absolutely amazing, but it doesn't feel like it's a completed piece of music. It just feels like an example of good musicianship, which is not music. Musicianship and good writing is not enough to be good music, necessarily. Now, there are some nice vocal harmonies, though, but not enough to say that it's a good vocal performance overall. And so, yeah, it's really just more of a guitar piece than it is a real Led Zeppelin song. But it is definitely a really good song. I really like listening to it, but it's not as good as Led Zeppelin have been, necessarily. And it's just, the solos are okay, and the biggest problem is it just feels undynamic. It doesn't feel dynamic at all at any stage of the song, really. So now we move on to the next song, For Your Life. Now this is has a good riff and has some really good bass work, but it's so repetitive. It's only like 6.5 minutes long, which is not that long for Led Zeppelin standards, but is just repetitive, and it's a little bit boring at times. So yeah, I just don't really like this song so much. Kind of a bit funky at times, but yeah, overall there's just nothing that special. Now we move on to Royal Orleans. Now this is extremely funky. Again, it's just bland, nothing that special. The riff is average. It's quite short, so at least it's got that going for it. And but other than that, it's just a kind of forgettable kind of piece. Now we move on to Nobody's Fault But Mine. Now this is actually a really good song. Really distorted playing in the opening, really memorable opening with the vocal harmonies. So yeah, it starts off really well. I really like the opening. Quite bluesy at times, and you got the harmonica playing from Robert Plant. That's pretty good. Now, unlike the previous two tracks, this song is actually quite dynamic. Lots of tempo changes, lots of loud and kind of, you know what dynamic means, so I'm not going to go into that. But yeah, so this is actually quite a good song. Now we move on to the next song, which is Candy Store Rock. This was the single. Well, they're not very particularly high charting at all, but bad vocals, just vocal performance, don't like it at all. It's not Led Zeppelin. That's the one thing from this album. A lot of it doesn't feel like Led Zeppelin. Now, that's not a complaint necessarily if it's still good, but in this case, the writing's not that good in my opinion. And it sounds like sort of 50s kind of rock and roll. Has a kind of Elvis kind of a feel, and I'm nothing against Elvis, but not my favorite musicians of all time. So yeah, a bit of an unforgettable track. Now we move on to Hot's On For Nowhere. That's an interesting title. Again, doesn't feel like Led Zeppelin at all. The vocal performance is just shallow and empty. Not good at all. It's just kind of a mediocre, nothing that special kind of a song. Now we move on to T for One. Now this is possibly my favorite song. It's probably either this or Achilles' Last Stand, or maybe Nobody's Fault But Mine. The first song, Nobody, and T for One are the only songs I would really say are important as far as Led Zeppelin's catalog goes. But this is basically trying an imitation of Since I've Been Loving You. Similar kind of chord structure and that kind of stuff. On a technical level, it's quite similar, but just stylistically, it's a blues epic, just like Since I've Been Loving You. And they just wanted to go back and do that kind of stuff, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with a band doing that. I don't think it's as good as Since I've Been Loving You, but that's one of the best Led Zeppelin songs of all time, so... But it's actually a really good song, T for One. Has a really heavy opening, really good vocals. Unlike the rest of the album, great vocals. The title actually comes from Plant in hotel rooms when he's touring, you know, having T for One, and it's about homesickness and wanting to be with family, which is obviously kind of blue and down and sad, so it goes with the kind of bluesy feel. And this is actually quite simple. There's nothing really complex about the song, but it's still very effective, and I really like the song. Really deep bass, really atmospheric bass playing from John Paul Jones, which is something lacking from a lot of this album, is atmosphere. So yeah, amazing Return to Roots. I really like this song. And so yeah, that's Presence. On a technical level, there's nothing wrong with it, and if you haven't heard anything else by Led Zeppelin, and you just listen to this album, you'll probably like it, because it's an alright rock album. But it suffers from the fact of what's come before it, and it also suffers from the fact it's just stylistically has nothing going for it. But it's not a terrible album at all, so I'm going to give Presence by Led Zeppelin a 6 out of 10. Later.